Point number 4. You say again rightly that those are the kinds of things of which people generally tend to take note and write about. Yes, then why do you suppose there are no good instances of contemporaries denying that these events took place? There was no shortage of skeptics then. Surely someone hearing of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection would have been able to refute it, since it happened in broad daylight amongst crowds of tourists at Jerusalem for the Passover. At the very least, you must infer that the authors of the Gospels took a huge risk in boasting of these occurrences to their fellows, many of whom had been in attendance. And what about the real historical figures, like Caiaphas and Pilate? Had these tracts been in any way slanderous? It is beyond doubt that they and their offspring would have cried outrage, silence, the muteness of those who can say nothing in defense of their own characters. Of all the vehement naysayers and critics of the early church, I can think of none that put forth contrary evidence. Can you? Is this not the other side of the coin? The reversal of your insistence on corroboration? Is there no burden on the doubter to explain why little or no eyewitness or even second-hand disputation exists? Why no one ever said, "I was there that weekend, it never happened"? Well, this excuse is at least novel, but it suffers from several unwarranted assumptions. First, it assumes that Jesus was an historical figure who actually lived during the timeline the Gospels offer. I'm not convinced of that. After some pretty exhaustive research of my own, my thinking is that there may have been some historical figure to which the Gospel writers later attributed these elaborate stories, but that early Christianity was largely Gnostic and in no need of an actual physical being. Regardless, the timeline for whomever may have served as the inspiration can't really be established. But even if that's not the case, and we assume the historicity of the Jesus of the canonical Gospels and accept the timeline, this objection assumes that anyone would have cared about the claims of a ragged little group of nutbars making outrageous claims in the first century Roman Empire. Such groups were a dime a dozen at the time. You had the Messiah from the People's Front of Judea. The Judean People's Front, they had their Messiah too. And remember, the Gospels weren't even written until the latter part of the first century, and clearly not even by the people who supposedly witnessed these events. The Gospels themselves are anonymous, and many other Gospels were floating around, telling a very different story about Jesus. They simply weren't canonized. But by the end of the first century, generous estimates put the Christian population at 0.6% of the Roman Empire. Who could possibly care about this tiny little group of zealots? 99.4% of people thought otherwise, or perhaps didn't even know of the Christians. And then, which group of Christians should they care about? There was absolutely no unity in the church at that time, and each group hated the other more than the next. But the biggest assumption here is grounded in a complete ignorance of the historical record. I can't think of another group of people in history so adept at purging heretics and people who disagreed as the Christians, and for so long. Even in the early 2nd century, before the power of the Roman Empire took over, the most brutal, violent purges of anyone practicing an unorthodox version of the faith were taking place, and by everyone, because everyone thought that they were the true Christians. One group murdered an entire other group of Christians by going in one Sunday morning into their church and just killing everyone. Can you feel the love? I still think it would be a stretch to expect people in the first century to have cared one way or the other, but if they did, knew otherwise, and wrote anything about it, I have a hard time believing that document would have survived. Is it the other side of the coin? Not even slightly. Demanding evidence or corroboration of something extraordinary happening is hardly the same thing as demanding evidence or corroboration for something ordinary happening. The one happens every day, the other never seems to have happened at all. Point number 5. If Jesus told his followers that they would be able to raise the dead and uproot trees, etc., he could well have meant the race of man, including its descendants, us. Being a visionary, a prophet, he was in the habit of predicting the future. It is not outlandish to think that humanity's progress might achieve these things, from resuscitation to cryonics, backhoes, and bulldozers. You say, frankly, I'm not interested in an explanation of why believers can't just do that.
Just put up or shut up.
You may play the game of ridiculing religious folks' attempt at ratiocination, but I'm afraid you can't dismiss the idea of trying to analyze a given subject, define the proper terms, interpret correctly, and sensibly place anecdotes in a reasonable context. That is what scientists and researchers do. You are clearly conniving to exclude believers from the practice of making cases that meet acceptable standards.
No. You don't get to claim some connection to a transcendent supernatural entity, puff out your chest by making all kinds of incredible claims like the fantastical stories of arcs or exodi, or telling people that Jesus' followers will be able to do all kinds of amazing supernatural things, and then, when you can't produce, expect people to be happy with your pathetic, lame excuses. These apologists don't want to be saddled with their own history. They say our interpretation of these holy books is too literal, forgetting that we didn't start it. That literal interpretation was believed by nearly every believer for the last 2,000 years, and still is by many. Hell, they locked up Galileo because some stupid verse in Psalms, a book of poetry basically, suggested the earth didn't move. And most importantly, the authors of these holy books themselves likely believed it as well. Which just goes to show you how ignorant these people were. These people should have been trying to figure out where the sun went at night or who would win the battle of dark versus light. And instead, religious folks embraced their ignorance, completely mistaking it for transcendence. You want to compare yourself with science? Then act like a scientist. Any researcher who made such bold predictions and claims and couldn't produce would be laughed out of the profession. Remember those two guys who claimed to have discovered cold fusion back in 1989? Yeah, neither do I. Because they couldn't produce. That never happens with religion. No matter how wrong, or in the case of religious ethics, wrong-headed, religion never just says, whoops, sorry, we were wrong about that. Maybe genocide isn't a good idea, or maybe no one actually crammed all those animals into a boat. And why would they? When they can continue to reel in the big bucks, tax-free by the way, and fool people with these lame excuses. If you could get people to buy the original literal bullshit yesteryear, there's not a chance in hell they'll be quick enough to pick up on this new reinterpreted bullshit now. Not while there are guys like this around shoveling it left and right.